Welcome to the IRB application series. This is the last presentation of the semester. Topic today is working with vulnerable populations. I'm John Barker. I'm the vice chair of the IRB, and I will be your host today. So, what do we mean by a vulnerable subject? Well, the definition is vulnerable subjects are persons who have difficulty providing voluntary informed consent arising from limitations in decision-making capacity or situational circumstances, or because they are especially at risk for exploitation. That's not regulatory language, but that is an accepted definition. So let's pick that apart. So what are you vulnerable to if you're a vulnerable subject? Well, you could be vulnerable to coercion, meaning that you are going to be pressured, induced, incentivized into doing something that you might not otherwise do, and you may have difficulty granting voluntary informed consent. So that would be vulnerability to coercion or undue influence. Or there's also vulnerability to exploitation. You have a diminished ability to protect yourself or greater capacity to be harmed. So these are the two basic types of vulnerability. And when subjects are vulnerable, then they need extra protection. And in many cases, there are extra regulatory requirements when your human subjects include vulnerable subjects or vulnerable populations. Okay, so here are just some examples of vulnerable subjects. Children, pregnant women, persons with physical disabilities, persons with mental disabilities, prisoners, students, we come back to that, racial or ethnic minorities, and the list goes on. This is actually an open-ended list. When your subjects include people with vulnerabilities, then that does create some special responsibilities on your part and on the part of the IRB. Basically, extra care is required to minimize the risk of coercion and harm. That's your core responsibility when you are doing research with vulnerable populations. And the IRB also has a responsibility here. The IRB will just apply extra scrutiny to make sure that the risks are minimized. Okay, and depending on the population, again, there may be specific policy requirements and specific federal requirements. So let's start with the actual federal requirements and the actual policy requirements. There are three vulnerable populations that are recognized by the federal common rule. So that's the overall regulatory framework that we follow with human subjects research. One is children. The second category is pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. And the third category is prisoners. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through those three categories and explain the ramifications if you happen to work with them as human subjects. So starting with children. So children are considered to be vulnerable to coercion. They have less agency than adults. They have less ability to grant informed consent. Yeah, they have a reduced ability to consent. And they may also be vulnerable to exploitation. So children have a reduced ability compared to adults to protect themselves from harm. So for both of these reasons, children are considered vulnerable population. And if you have any children within your subject pool, then your IRB application is going to go through full board review. The full convened IRB is going to have a look at your application. And also the consent process works a little bit differently when children are involved. And also the allowable risks are defined a little bit more narrowly for children than they are for adults. Okay, so let's go over those last 2 points. Okay, so these are the approval criteria. And this is in regard to risk. So when it comes to risk, the main thing that the IRB does is it looks to minimize the risk, but also to verify that if there is any risk to human subjects, then it is justified by the benefits of the study. And especially if the risk is more than minimal. Okay, now that's the general standard that applies to adults or children, but with children, when the risks are more than minimal, the approval criteria are more stringent. For more detail, you can, if you are planning to do a study of more than minimal risk involving children, then invite you to come talk to us about that. Most of the research that happens at UIS is minimal risk. So this would not apply to most people. Okay. But if you are interested in the details, they can be found in the IRB policy as well as in the federal common rule. Okay. What will apply to you if you do research with children is that the consent process is very different. So for adults, adult subjects will consent to be part of the research. They will give informed consent. Children are considered, in general, too young to give informed consent. So children, instead of granting consent, they grant what is called assent. So that means the child agrees to be in the study. Even that would not apply to very young children. Of course, infants are too young even to grant to agree to be in the study. But when the children is old enough, then we require that the child agree to be in the study. And in addition, the parents or guardians must grant permission. Okay. And both of these things are required. So you need the child's assent and you need the parent's permission. Okay. So that's that's how it works with children. Okay, the second vulnerable population is pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. Now, this one is slightly different. Pregnant women are considered a vulnerable population. However, this is not because pregnant women are considered to be especially vulnerable to coercion or exploitation. That's not the reason. The rules about pregnant women and the extra protections are mostly geared toward protecting fetuses and the neonates themselves. And these mostly kick in when there is more than minimal risk or some risk at all to the fetus. So they wouldn't generally kick in if the study poses no risk to the fetus or to the neonate. They mainly are applicable in the context of medical research. Okay. Okay, nonetheless, there are ramifications for the approval process. So if your study is targeted to pregnant women, then it will not be exempt. As you know, there's a category of research called exempt, which makes the approval process simpler. That category does not apply when the study is targeted towards pregnant women. Okay, and of course the IRB will take a close look at this to make sure that all the harms are minimized, etc. Okay, however, if a study only incidentally includes pregnant women as part of a broader population, then it may be exempt. Okay, so in that case, all of the special rules about pregnant women as a vulnerable population do not apply. So for example, if you were doing a survey and you were asking pregnant women, what is your experience of being pregnant, or something like that, then that would be targeted toward pregnant women, and so it would not be exempt. But if you're just doing a general survey, like a general internet survey, and some of the people participating in the survey just happen to be pregnant, that's fine. You don't need to take any special action. You don't need to screen out people because they're pregnant. You don't have to, and it can be exempt. Okay. Okay, So that's population number 2. We've looked at children, we've looked at pregnant women. Third population is prisoners. So this is the third population that's recognized by the Federal Common Rule as vulnerable. So prisoners are considered to be vulnerable to coercion and exploitation. They're vulnerable to coercion because they have limited freedom. And they're vulnerable to exploitation because they're incarcerated. They have less ability to protect themselves. So for these reasons, they require extra protection. And the rule here is very similar to the rule for pregnant women. A target, although we do apply more scrutiny in this case, if a study is targeted at prisoners, it will receive full board review. Okay, that's not an ironclad common rule requirement, but that is a UIS policy. We always give full board review to research that is targeted at prisoners. And in fact, when the IRB meets to review such a study, then the board will include a prisoner expert and or prisoner advocate to bring the prisoner perspective to bear. Okay. On the other hand, if a study only incidentally includes prisoners as part of a larger subject pool, then these rules don't apply. So for example, if you're doing a study that anyone with internet access can do, and some people just happen to be in prison and they have internet access and they participate in your study, then that's fine. You don't need to screen out prisoners from your study in that case. But if you're specifically studying prisoners and specifically targeting prisoners, then your study will go through full board review. Okay, and we have done studies like that. We do have experience with this, the IRB. Okay, so those are the 3 vulnerable populations according to the Federal Common Rule. But there are other vulnerable populations as well. Okay? Populations that are considered vulnerable even though they don't trigger any specific regulatory requirement. Okay, so these are other populations that are considered vulnerable, but for which there's no specific regulatory requirement. And the list is open-ended. So if your subject population is considered vulnerable, if it's part of this open-ended list, then the IRB will apply extra scrutiny to ensure adequate protection. There aren't any formal rules per se that are different, except that the IRB will exert extra scrutiny and also that your study may not be exempt. So what are these other vulnerable populations? Well, like I said, the list is open-ended, but some examples include persons with physical disabilities, persons with mental disabilities, students, racial or ethnic minorities, economically disadvantaged people, socially disadvantaged people, terminally ill or very sick individuals, individuals who are institutionalized. So other than being in prison, might be in some other kind of institution. Okay, but then again, the list is open-ended. These are just some examples that are recognized as vulnerable. Now, in each of these cases, just as we did with prisoners and with pregnant women, we make a distinction between whether your research is targeted at a vulnerable population or whether it just incidentally includes some vulnerable individuals. Okay. When it is targeted at a vulnerable population, then extra scrutiny is applied and your study in general won't be considered exempt. Okay. On the other hand, if members of a vulnerable population are only incidentally included as part of a broader study population, then this extra scrutiny generally doesn't apply. So, for example, you don't need, if you're doing a general survey, your survey may very well include any number of people from any number of these lists, unless you explicitly screen out everyone who might conceivably belong to a vulnerable population, which really wouldn't be practical. So of course, we don't ask you to do that. And that study could still be exempt depending on, depending on the conditions. And that's fine. But if your study is specifically targeted at a vulnerable population, then it will receive a little bit of extra scrutiny. Okay, so you may notice I mentioned students as a vulnerable population. Students are considered a vulnerable population, and specifically students in your own classes. So when you're doing research where the subjects are students that are in that you are currently teaching, then the students may not feel empowered to say no. They may not feel that they're allowed to decline to participate in the study. They may feel that they need to participate in the study to get a good grade, even after you tell them otherwise, right? And that's a concern because participation in human subjects research has to be voluntary. You can't require people to participate. So because of this, okay, so students may not feel empowered to decline to participate. And because of this, if you do plan to do research involving your own students, then you need to explain to the board how you're going to mitigate this risk. Okay, so that's the main dimension of dealing with students as a vulnerable population. Okay, so that's all of the theory. What I want to do now is just go over the specific parts of the IRB application that involve vulnerable populations in one way or another. There's no single central place in the application where we cover this. It's kind of spread out. So I want to go over all those parts of the application. So we'll start with section 6 about participants and recruitment. So here you're just telling the IRB who your subjects are going to be. And there's a long list of specific populations, and you're being asked if you are going to include them. You notice the second item is minors, or less than or equal to 17 years old. Side note, it says there complete section 8B. That's actually kind of a mistake in the application. If you go to 8B, it's got nothing to do with minors. So you can actually ignore that. I mean, fill out 8B if it's applicable, but it's got nothing to do with this. Okay, so please check that if any of your subjects are going to be minors, and also if you're going to target any of the other listed populations, like a targeted sex, targeted race or ethnicity. This is where you indicate that. Section 6B continues on, also includes college students. If any of your students are, or if you're going to target college students, whether your own students or somebody else's students, this is where you give us the details for that. And at the end, we have just a selection of other vulnerable populations. And you'll notice that the next to last line, people with limited civil freedom, prisoners, parolees, probationers. So if you're going to do research involving prisoners, you would check this. This is another case where our application is kind of not perfect because we lump prisoners, parolees, and probationers together into a single group, but really they're a different group. The conditions that apply to, or the rules that apply to prisoners don't actually apply to parolees or probationers. So we still want to know if any of those will be, any parolees or probationers will be in your subject pool, or if you're going to target them. But we also specifically want to know if they're prisoners because that triggers some very specific rules. Okay. Section 8E, describe all steps taken to minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. So we ask you to fill out this section regardless, but it's particularly important if you're working with a vulnerable population because vulnerable populations are at elevated risk of coercion or undue influence. So extremely important to explain the steps you're going to take to minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Okay. 11A, what factors may interfere or influence the collection of voluntary informed consent? Okay, this is particularly important if you're doing research involving your own students or with someone with whom you have some kind of supervisory relation. So for example, if you were a supervisor of somebody, then if you're an employer, then and you're doing research with your employees, then you would need to indicate that here. Or if the participants have a close relationship to anyone on the research team, or any other kind of close relation that may make the subjects feel less, less empowered to say no to being in the study. And if any of those apply, then we need you to explain the procedures to mitigate those factors. Okay. And the research involves pregnant women, fetuses, or neonates, then you would fill out this section. Again, this refers to a requirement that, mostly kicks in when there's a particular risk to the fetus or to the neonate. And so there's federal rules about who you need to get permission from. In those cases, you need to get permission from both parents. In most cases, there are exceptions. If any of that applies, you would explain it here. Again, most of the research, I don't think we've yet seen any research where this would apply. So if it doesn't apply to you, say not applicable. But if you are planning on doing research of this nature, then come talk to us and we'll explain the requirements in detail. And last part of the application, if the research involves children, explain who consent will be obtained from. In general, it says consent there, it really should say parental permission. In general, permission is to be obtained from both parents, although there are exceptions to that. If there is only one parent or if both parents are not available. And so basically the language here just summarizes the regulatory language. And if this doesn't apply to you, just indicate not applicable. Okay, and that is it. I guess this is a brief presentation. Are there any questions?